Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 83 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. When we think about North American slaves and slavery, most of our minds take us to plantations in southern North America or in the Caribbean. We picture plantation field hands or big house slaves. However, slavery existed in the colonial Northeast too, and slavery looked very different there than it did on southern or Caribbean plantations. Today, Jared Hardesty, an assistant professor of history at Western Washington University, will take us on a tour of slavery and the lives enslaved people lived in colonial Boston. During our exploration, Jared reveals details about colonial Boston and how its people justified slavery, origins of Boston slaves and where Bostonians purchased them, and what life was like for enslaved men and women in colonial Boston. But first, are you a member of the Ben Franklin's World community on Facebook? There are more than 400 history lovers in this community, and we are always looking for more people to chat about history with and to share our ideas about how the past has influenced the present. To join the community, text BFWorld233-444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button on the home screen. Are you ready to embark on our tour of slavery in colonial Boston? Let's go meet our knowledgeable guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an assistant professor of history at Western Washington University. He considers himself a scholar of colonial America, the Atlantic world, and the history of slavery. Today, he joins us to discuss details from his new book, Unfreedom, Slavery and Dependence in 18th-Century Boston. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jared Hardesty.
Thank you for having me, Liz.
We tend to think of colonial Boston as a religious place, a place that should have eschewed slavery. But like colonists everywhere in colonial North America, colonial Bostonians purchased and used slaves. Jared, would you tell us about colonial Boston and how its people justified slavery?
This is an interesting point because we oftentimes don't think about Boston as having a large enslaved population, yet by the middle decades of the 18th century, about 15% of the town's population was enslaved. And I think it comes out of an interesting tension during the settlement period of New England. You know, we all know the stories of Puritans going out for their errand in the wilderness to carve out a godly community, a godly society in the forests of North America. But I think what we oftentimes lose sight of is the centrality of work and labor to that mission. I mean, you have to literally create societies. And the Puritans very early on found themselves short of labor. And there are times of questions, how do we address this labor shortage? Some people advocated for English indentured servants. Others advocated for slavery. In fact, as early as 1630, there are letters going back and forth between Governor John Winthrop and other leading Puritans about maybe we need to import slaves as a way to better settle our communities. And the reason slavery made sense is that people like John Winthrop and other leading Puritans, they lived in a world where Englishmen had been encountering slavery for the previous 150 years. It seemed every time an English man or woman would leave England and they would travel to Africa or to Latin America or to North America or Asia, everywhere they would go, they would encounter slaves and slavery. And so it almost became kind of an easy device, like, oh, we need labor. Why don't we turn to slaves and try to bring slaves into our colonies? And so as early as 1630, they're talking about slavery. By 1638, if not earlier, we have the first official records of slaves being there. And so to kind of answer the question, the short answer is that there is this tension between the kind of religious mission, especially the idea of hard work. There's a fear, for example, that bringing in too much bound labor, be they indentured servants or slaves, would create idleness amongst the Puritans. And so that concern, however, seemed to oftentimes be pushed to the wayside in favor of a more pragmatic desire, a pragmatic need for workers of any type, be they indentured servants or slaves.
Let's get into some of the specifics about slavery. Tom would like to know details about the business of buying and caring for slaves in Boston. Where did Boston slaves come from and how much did they cost?
That's a really hard question to answer. The first part of it is not too bad where they came from, but the how much they cost is really kind of an interesting story, which I'll talk about here in a second. But where they came from, a variety of places. By the early 18th century, there's essentially two primary sources of slaves for Boston. The first is from Africa via the transatlantic slave trade. Oftentimes what would happen is, especially once Rhode Island became active in the slave trade, they'd bring slaves from West Africa to Rhode Island, and Boston merchants would purchase them. Very few Boston merchants actually engaged directly in the slave trade. We have a record of about 30 voyages, which seemingly large, but compared to Rhode Island or Bristol or Liverpool in England, certainly not. Many of those African slaves were from a region of Africa called Senegambia, which is the kind of northern part of West Africa, heavily Islamicized region. The other source of slaves, which I found so fascinating, and I didn't realize this before, were many of them were born in the Caribbean. And these are called Caribbean Creoles. They're the children of enslaved people on West Indian sugar plantations, namely from Barbados, although I also have evidence of them from Jamaica and even from Dutch Suriname. And they'd oftentimes sell the children of these Creoles to Boston merchants who would take them back. And these are slaves who are brought up in a world they speak English, they understand kind of the Anglo-American institutions, so it's a very different type of slavery. In terms of the purchase price, that's a bit more difficult to answer. One of the major problems with studying Massachusetts and Boston in the 18th century is the currency fluctuations. The colony printed paper money, which caused it to be highly devalued. And so you see slave prices sometimes as high as 450 or 500 pounds, but that was oftentimes valued and undervalued Massachusetts currency. Just as a kind of average is what I figured out in the course of doing this research, an able-bodied male slave, so a male slave between the ages of about 18 and 35 or so, worth about 100 pounds sterling. In terms of sale, I've seen sale prices as high as 100, 150 pounds sterling for a skilled male slave, but you also actually find a number of slaves offered for free in the newspaper, usually the children of enslaved families, infants who the master cannot care for.
After making the decision to purchase a slave, where would a Bostonian go to find one?
There's a number of ways that I found. Oftentimes, you could go to a tavern. Taverns became sites of slave sales, especially slaves recently brought into Boston, either from the Caribbean or from Rhode Island or from Africa. And there'd be slaves for sale there. You'd also find in the newspaper a number of Bostonians advertised in the newspaper, slaves for sale of various types, men, women, children, slaves from Africa, Creoles from the Caribbean. But also, individual merchants with their kind of trade connections were able to make special requests. For example, Peter Faneuil of Faneuil Hall fame in Boston, who funded the meeting place and market. He has this famous letter where he writes to one of his ship captains, actually who was engaged in the slave trade, asking for a 12-year-old boy to serve in his household. There's a very famous judge from Massachusetts named Nathaniel Byfield, and he left a very long will. And in this will, he discusses his enslaved woman, Rose. And he talks about the actual process of buying her. And he talks about traveling to Bristol, Rhode Island, and he found this sick kind of, I think she's about 12 years old, when he purchased her, and he brought her back to health and educated her, and he eventually freed her in his will, but he kind of gives her biography and how he came to purchase her in the will. So a variety of ways.
Brian would like to know how many slaves an average slaveholder owned and how slavery in Boston differed from slavery elsewhere in the colonies. So let's start with slaveholders. Were slaveholders a majority of the Boston population, and how many slaves did an average Boston slaveholder own?
During the course of the 18th century, roughly a quarter of all Boston households had slaves. I found that by looking through probate inventories and kind of tabulating and dividing by the total number of probate inventories versus those of slaves. About a quarter of all families. And so it's actually a sizable number, but not a majority. As for the number of slaves that were held, it's usually 1 to 2. So it's a very small slaveholding society. You'll find some wealthier merchants with 5, 7, sometimes I think the highest I found was about 10. But for the most part, it's on average 1 to 2 slaves living in a household.
And how did slavery in Boston differ from elsewhere in the colonies? For example, did their living arrangements differ from slaves in the South and in the Caribbean?
That's going to vary. So what you'll find is a lot of times, especially people who only own 1 or 2 slaves, they would oftentimes live in the house, oftentimes in a kind of a marginal space of the house, a closet or upstairs. One of the funny stories about slavery in Boston is oftentimes slaves would live upstairs in a room that was right above the fireplace. This was considered a bad room in the house, but of course it's also the warmest place in the wintertime. So they would live in the master's house. You do find stories of wealthier families. For example, the Borland family, who are a Scots merchant's family, family, they built a third floor on their mansion house just to house their slaves. So mostly in the homes of the masters, but the kind of most famous exception to this is the royal family, who today their house is in Medford, Massachusetts, and they have a freestanding slave quarters. The family relocated from Antigua in the Caribbean and brought 21 slaves with them, and they built an independent slave quarters, and actually that's still there standing today. You can visit it. It's a wonderful site, but that kind of is the exception that proves the rule of small holding and living in the household with the master.
How else did the lives of Boston slaves differ from the lives of slaves in the South?
Very different. In terms of working life, most slaves in Boston, of course, were not engaged in any sort of agriculture. They lived with their masters in little kind of townhomes on plot. Enslaved women would garden a little bit. But most enslaved men, who made up the majority of Boston's population, which is a little different also from the American South, which is about 50-50 divided male and female. Boston's over 60% male slaves. Most of the men were tradesmen, either skilled, so blacksmiths, coopers. Others were kind of provided menial supplemental labor to artisans, or they worked on the docks as stevedores. You'd also find enslaved men were sailors. About 25%, I think historians estimate, of enslaved men in Massachusetts were sailors. And so a sizable population were on the high seas at any given time. So it's a very different kind of working world than that of the American South. The diet is interesting. I had a really hard time finding what slaves were eating. This is a question that kind of has bugged me in the course of writing the book. And you'll find entries in masters' account books about, providing some cheese for their slaves, some meat, some rum, things like that. But it was really hard to figure out what they were eating, whereas on a large plantation in the Caribbean or in the American South, they have to buy such large amounts of food for the enslaved people. This really show up in account books, and you can kind of figure out the diet. In terms of diet, my best guess would be they ate a pretty similar diet to other working class Bostonians. And so it's going to be a lot of cornmeal. It's going to be a lot of pork, but also there will be some vegetables and some cider and some beers and things like that.
Did Boston slaves have social lives? Were they able to form any friendships or families?
This is something I found fascinating when we're thinking about the contrast from the South and the Caribbean. One of the things that we have to remember is that in Boston, even at the height of slavery, they're only about 15% of the population, and it's 60% male. And so this prevents a lot of the kind of social interaction we think of when we think about slave communities in the American South, primarily enslaved people, large communities living kind of side by side, intermarrying, having children. That's a little different in Boston. Enslaved people do marry one another. There's about 40% of the population is female. But what's really interesting is, especially towards the end of the colonial period, beginning in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, you begin seeing large numbers of enslaved Boston men marrying Native American women. Native American women from kind of eastern Massachusetts, many of them have lost husbands. Native American communities owe a certain amount of military service to the colony of Massachusetts. So the men end up going off and fighting and dying in imperial wars, leaving a disproportionate number of Native American women. And they intermarry with the enslaved African men, and oftentimes the children produced in these unions will identify as Indian and take up residence on reservations and things like that, because the wives are free, and so by law, the children are also free. You see that very interesting, which is so different from other places. But in terms of kind of social interaction, you see large numbers of enslaved Bostonians, they hang out and fraternize and socialize with poorer white workers, free laborers, but also indentured servants, apprentices. So there's a lot of social mixing at the bottom of the kind of social hierarchy. You've seen the records of fornication, for example, between black men and poorer white women. And so there's interaction at the margins of society between whites and blacks. It's quite interracial. They go to taverns together. They dance together. All of these things kind of show up in the record and oftentimes horrifies authorities. That's why they show up in the records. Most of the fraternization happened at night after the working day was over. Despite the fact there was a curfew, most enslaved men and women ignored that, quite to the chagrin of both their masters and white Boston at large. And there are certain spaces of interaction. This is one of the more fascinating things I discovered, is that the kitchen of the master's home, especially after hours, so in the evening, at night, was the place for slave socialization and relatively accepted. There's this great case about one enslaved man whose name's Quaco, and Quaco was brought from Suriname to Boston, and he's accused of poisoning another slave whose name is Boston to add a layer of confusion. And Quaco met with Boston and his wife In the kitchen of Quaco's wife, her name is Jenny. And one of the most interesting things is in the depositions and testimonies of this case, the white family who owned Jenny were called to testify. And in the course of the testimony, they talk about, yes, we know Quaco, and yes, we know Boston and his wife, but they just accept it as normal that Jenny used the kitchen as a meeting space, and that after hours, this was kind of her place to entertain and to meet guests and to kind of relax. And so it was really remarkable that in the case of an enslaved woman, able to carve out a space for herself in the master's home and have it recognized.
Did Boston slaves have any social holidays? I know in Albany and elsewhere in New York, slaves had a holiday called Pinkster, which took place around Pentecost, but it was very much a social holiday. And I wonder, did Boston slaves have something similar?
In New England, yes, there's a holiday called Negro Election Day, and becomes quite common by the 1750s, especially in rural parts of New England. This was an opportunity for slaves to gather, and they'd picnic and all that, but they'd also then elect a king, and after the Revolution, they elect a president, appropriately enough. And that person was kind of a community leader in that. But I never found evidence of that happening in Boston, and I think there's some reasons for that. The first is that this is a very kind of an African tradition, and so much of Boston's population was actually not African. They were African-American, Creoles from the West Indies or elsewhere. There's also a large Negro Election Day in Lynn, Massachusetts, which is just really kind of across the Charles River, relatively close. And given the kind of working mobility and autonomy slaves had in Boston, they could go there. I also think there are serious issues if hundreds of people of African descent gathered in a public space in Boston. It would have been serious cause for alarm. And so these kind of factors prevent that. So you don't actually see kind of special holidays. But if you look into the records, there are a couple kind of big social events that enslaved Bostonians are part of. The first is Muster Day. They're often the day the militia gathers on the common and drill, and this was kind of a big public gathering once a month or so. Slaves are always there, usually actually literally on the margins of the main festivities, but playing games and fraternizing with fellow slaves, but also servants and other kind of menial laborers. But also funerals are the other big kind of social gathering. When someone of standing in the Black community in Boston would die, there'd be a massive funeral. There's stories of being 200 people in a funeral trail, mixed race of both white and Black, for leading kind of African Americans in colonial Boston. The reason we know so much about them because they were cause for alarm. They're somber to a certain extent, but they're also cause for celebration. So they're musical, they're lively, and this is cause for alarm amongst white Bostonians. So we have a lot of records of Black funerals. It's tended to be a gathering space, kind of public ceremony for them.
It sounds like slavery in Boston not only differed from slavery in the South, but from slavery elsewhere in New England and the Northeast too.
In terms of New England slavery, absolutely. By the numbers, it has the largest number of enslaved people. Newport, Rhode Island actually has a larger proportion of enslaved people, which is about 25% enslaved. Boston, like I said, about 15% by the middle of the 18th century. Other New England port towns, Newport, Rhode Island being the big one, are also just as kind of enmeshed in this world. But when I think about Boston and its commonalities, I think of it more as there's a number of these kind of Atlantic port cities that pop up in 17th and 18th century that are hubs of trade and commerce and culture for the circulation of goods and ideas and people. And if you look at, say, Dutch Curacao, which has a sizable enslaved population who are mostly engaged in the trades. If you look at Bermuda, a sizable enslaved population, many of them are actually sailors. Other urban areas, Philadelphia, for example, or even New York and Newport, this is kind of an urban Atlantic phenomenon for trade hubs where you see this sizable enslaved population who work in specialized trades and oftentimes interact with other kind of bound independent laborers. So I think the commonality there is kind of a creation of the Atlantic world, that Boston's one of many kind of entrepôts or trade hubs that ends up with a very large and skilled slave population.
To go back to our conversation about the social lives of slaves in colonial Boston, would you speak about the role that religion played in slaves' ability to form a community?
It's remarkable just how prevalent people of African descent are in the church records, in the vital records of baptisms, in marriage records, in parishioner lists, in alms lists even, receiving alms. They're ubiquitous. It's really hard to not see them. And it doesn't matter denomination, whether they're congregational or Episcopalian. The Huguenot Church in Boston has enslaved people in it. All of these churches have Black members. And it raised this kind of interesting question, why? In some cases, we actually have the testimony and depositions of enslaved people that tell us why. And one of my favorite stories is there's a Congolese man who lived in Boston, and Congo's in West Central Africa. And he talks about his reason to join the Episcopalian Church, the Anglican Church in Boston. And in his kind of testimony, he says, Yeah, I chose to be Anglican because I was Catholic, and it's the most similar to Catholicism. And so there is this kind of religious desire, this religious motive behind joining churches in Boston to fulfill spiritual needs and things like that. But there's also, I think there's a lot of kind of pragmatic reasons. Slaves joined and affiliated themselves with churches. They are Protestant churches. There's not a Catholic church in Boston. And Protestantism emphasizes certain things that slaves might find useful. So, for example, literacy. And in fact, Cotton Mather, for a while, famous Boston minister, had a school for teaching slaves how to read. He has a number of tracts encouraging masters to teach slaves how to read so they have access to the Bible. Timothy Cutler, who was the minister of the Old North Church, or Christ Church, from the 1720s to the 1750s, I believe, he has a number of letters encouraging parishioners and masters to catechize and to teach their slaves how to read. And so there's a lot of usefulness beyond the spiritual side. And, some slaves are true believers, others probably were not. But there is a lot of usefulness that institutionalized religion can give to slaves. The other thing it does, for example, is it teaches them how to talk, to speak in the public sphere to others. For example, they learn to deploy Christian language in petitions, in appeals. There's a very famous divorce case where an enslaved woman wants to divorce her husband, and she makes explicit note to tell who the minister was who married them and what church she was affiliated with, because it gives her common ground with the people she's petitioning, the legislature in this case, and it also tells them that she understands the world she lives in, that this is a world where you deploy Christian language and you can use Christianity, and that's what makes you a member of the community and thus willing and allowed to petition the legislature.
We should talk about literacy a bit more, because in Unfreedom, Jared discusses how Boston may have had one of the most literate slave populations in the Atlantic world, and how slaves used their literacy to navigate and adapt to political and legal situations. Jared, would you tell us why Boston slaves had such a high literacy rate, and how did they use their literacy to navigate colonial politics and the American Revolution?
It's incredible. You see in every dimension of life, especially in public life. So you begin seeing slaves writing articles in the newspaper. There's a very famous article from Essex County of a slave named Caesar Sartor, wrote a long essay about needing to end slavery. Front page kind of article. You see that there. But you also see it in kind of more subtle form. For example, a number of slaves use their literacy to read the law, and they file suit against their masters. These are called freedom suits to gain their individual freedom. And it's a little rough going till really the kind of 1770s, but eventually slaves begin winning their freedom in lawsuits in which, of course, they're using their literacy to read law codes. They're also able to attract a number of white lawyers to help them in that. But they also see, beginning in 1773, a petition campaign where slaves and free blacks in Boston are writing petitions to the legislature, asking them for freedom. And these documents are remarkable if you see them, because you can tell that it's actually an enslaved or a free black person who's writing it, because the spelling is really phonetic. The handwriting's a little shaky, but that speaks to the power and the desire of what they're trying to do in appealing for freedom. And so there's about 7 of these petitions between 1773 and 1777 to different people, to the legislature of Massachusetts, to Governor Thomas Hutchinson, later to General Thomas Gage, essentially offering their services to Gage if he would free them. And they're very passionate and powerful appeals. And also, if you tap into these a little bit more, you're able to tease out the kind of intellectual networks that enslaved people were part of. You can tell what they've been reading and what they've been talking about. So, for example, there's a reference in one of the petitions to the Somerset case in England, which was a case in 1770 where a slave named Somerset sued his master for his freedom and won it. And that case provided judicial precedent for the end of slavery in England itself. The other thing you see, for example, is a discussion of different types of slave laws in the Americas. So they reference in one of the petitions that the Spanish have opportunities for manumission. They try to shame colonial authorities by saying, oh, well, even the Spanish have opportunities for manumission and to obtain their freedom. Why don't we? You see the literacy both in the appeal, but also in the kind of evidence they're using to make their appeal.
Let's explore the condition of slavery for a moment. We tend to think of freedom and slavery as polar opposites. If you're free, you're not a slave, and if you're a slave, you have no freedom. In Unfreedom, Jared posits that in order to understand slavery, we need to understand it within the colonial American context of Unfreedom. Jared, would you tell us about the continuum of Unfreedom? How did it operate within colonial American society?
This is kind of the thrust and the argument of my book. One of the things I had trouble with when I first started researching this was the incredible number of documents that showed interaction between enslaved people, indentured servants, apprentices, pauper apprentices, people like that. And it didn't quite make sense to me. And the types of things they were doing, the types of things they were advocating for didn't match up to our thoughts, which is, slaves are fighting for their freedom, kind of building communities to fight for their freedom. And rather, they're doing a number of other things. They're looking for autonomy, they're learning the law, they're trying to protect their families, they don't want to be sold away. All of these things are part of this. And I started to think about the kind of world that enslaved Bostonians inhabited in the 18th century. We tend to think, as you mentioned, slavery is a binary, right? There are free people and there are slaves. And in the American context, this is quite racialized. Free people are white and enslaved people are black. But if you look at the kind of social conditions of 18th century Boston, you see that on the one hand, you have free white people and then you have enslaved Africans, but there's this kind of spectrum, or what I call the continuum of unfreedom in between, where there are indentured servants, there are Indian slaves in Boston, there are pauper apprentices, and pauper apprentices are poor children that are bound out from their family's home, usually apprenticed to a wealthier master or to a tradesman to teach them some skills and essentially keep them off the streets. There's actual trade apprentices. And so there's all of these kind of categories of unfreedom or dependence that structure life in 18th century Boston. And it's that got me rethinking, what does that mean for the lives of enslaved people? The fact that roughly 75 to 80% of the people who live in Boston are in some state of dependence. Women are bound under the laws of coverture to their husbands or their fathers. Children are legally dependents of their parents. There's indentured servitude, there's apprenticeship, and there's slavery. What does that mean for slavery as an institution? And how does that affect the kind of lived experiences of enslaved people? And my argument is that it really kind of pushes them to look for autonomy, for independence, and to reshape the institution of slavery more than looking for emancipation or kind of a universal freedom or something like that.
In 1739, slaves in South Carolina fought against their slavery in the Stoner Rebellion. In 1741, New York City went up in flames in fires that many New Yorkers attributed to slaves. Did Boston slaves ever rebel and fight for their freedom?
You do see rebellion. The biggest conspiracy I found was in 1723. And this is one of the things that actually caused me to push the argument that I'm making in the book, is that in 1723, there was a conspiracy actually very similar to New York's. Buildings start going up flame at night. As it turns out, the town of Boston had just passed a number of big ordinance regulating the lives of slaves. So there's a curfew, slaves can't own liquor or firearms, and it targeted both free blacks and slaves, and actually Indians. It's a kind of a racialized law code. And in response, slaves begin burning the town. And eventually, 5 slaves are arrested and one indentured servant who is also a white indentured servant who is also part of the conspiracy. And we have one of their depositions. His name's Diego. Diego was probably what English people in the time period called Spanish Negroes. He was probably captured by a privateer off a Spanish ship, given his name, and brought to Boston. And in Diego's testimony, he implicates the other slaves who were arrested after him, but he's talking about his fellow slaves, and one of them's upset because he's about to be sold away. One of them's upset because he was a tradesman, and a white man publicly called him a thief in the streets, which destroyed kind of any trust or credibility he had. He was losing business because of this. But none of them are talking about freedom in the way we think about freedom. They're talking about their rights being violated. They're talking about wanting to maintain the kind of communities and families they already have. But we don't see a lot of discussion of kind of individual liberty, and especially the way we would conceive of it.
For slaves who had successful petitions, masters who manumitted them, or rebelled in such a way that they gained their freedom, what happened to them? What happened to Boston slaves once they gained their freedom?
Not good things. This is one of the reasons I make the argument about autonomy and independence in the book. One of the problems with free blacks is that to white colonial authorities, black freedom was oxymoronic. It did not make sense to them. Whereas slaves, as legal dependents, had a place in the hierarchy, was certainly at the bottom of the hierarchy. Their race had pushed them to the bottom of the social hierarchy. But nonetheless, their race kind of gave them a place in the hierarchy to appeal for rights and have grievances addressed and things like that. But free blacks removed themselves from the hierarchy. And this is, like I said, quite alien to white authorities who try to figure out how exactly do free blacks fit into society. And so you see the number of particularly nasty town ordinances and legislation specifically targeting free blacks. So for example, this is a world where everybody has obligations to the community and to society. And for most free white men, that obligation is the militia. They serve in the militia to defend their towns and their community. But for free blacks, they don't want to give them arms or teach them military skills. And so based off the number of days a white man owes to the militia, they calculate how many days free blacks will be forced to work on public works projects, namely roads and bridges, building them. And so they're coerced to labor once again. You know, the one point of freedom is that you can have proper ownership of your own labor. Here they are being forced to labor again. Another law targeting them had to do with their children. By law, they had to be bound out as apprentices. Once they were about 7 or 8 years old, they had to legally be bound out. And you see the overseers of the poor removing black children from the homes of free black families. And so this is, you know, another protection of freedom is supposed to be the protection of your family. And here it is being violated as the state is trying to fit free blacks into the social hierarchy and figure out how they work in society and their place in society. And it can be quite cruel. They're locked out of the labor market, for example. So you see there's a black family called the Humphreys family, a mother, a father, and 3 children. And the 3 children are bound out. The mother appears in the records of the Old North Church week after week after week asking for alms because her husband cannot find permanent employment. He dies relatively young, and she remains kind of begging for alms on the poor rolls in Boston.
Jared, we can tell you know a lot about the lived experiences of enslaved and free African and African Americans in 18th century Boston. But we know from our discussion with Jennifer Morgan in episode 70 that it is difficult to research the lives of enslaved people. Would you tell us about your research experience? What records did you use to get at these slaves' lives, and what roadblocks did you encounter while you conducted your research?
It was tough, I think, is the short answer, but I'm lucky in one way. When I was looking into what to research for, this is based off my dissertation, which I completed at Boston College, and I was looking for a project. I had this big, grand idea of a project, but it just couldn't be done as a graduate student. And so I was looking for a project, reading for my comprehensive exams, and I realized that no one had written a history of slavery in Boston. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I was in Boston, so I could kind of easily have access to the documents. And one of my advisors who does legal history, he told me, he said, there's this collection at the Massachusetts State Archives called the Suffolk Files, and it's all the file papers from the colonial courts, and it includes depositions and testimonies. He said, I guarantee you there's going to be material about slaves there because in Massachusetts did not have special slave courts, and so enslaved and free black people would have appeared before the same courts as everybody else. So he said, take a look there. And so I go to the State Archives, and I begin looking through the Suffolk Files, but there's a problem. They start with the founding of Massachusetts, and they go through 1799. They start with number 1, and they run chronologically up to hundreds of thousands. But there are indices, and going through the indices, whoever made them in the 19th century made special note when someone was black. And so all of a sudden, I quickly was able to compile a list of court cases that involved people of African descent. And it came out to be about 350 cases. And these cases are some of the most remarkable documents I've ever seen having to do with the history of slavery in terms of there's depositions, there's testimonies. And so you get to hear the voices of enslaved people in a very real and seemingly genuine fashion. There are problems with legal sources, and this is oftentimes what I'm fighting against in terms of interpretation, is that there's all sorts of biases built into it. It's hard to determine guilt or innocence. Many of the slaves are convicted of really horrible crimes, and of course that doesn't characterize the entire slave community. There's all sorts of issues with these. It's very easy to see action, for example, what they're doing. It's much harder to get what they're thinking in the documents. And there's also the issue of power. They're being deposed or their testimony is being taken by very wealthy, powerful men. So there's a certain element of deference and fear, even if it's just performative. There's also the issue that it's very easy to read thought into these documents when in fact the documents are just documenting action, what happened rather than what people are thinking. And so you have to be very careful not to read thought into action when using these sources. But nonetheless, if you use them in sort of the way I do, which is to kind of get at the granularity of everyday life when they talk about their experience, you know, what they're doing, where they're working, who they know, these sorts of elements, these are some of the best records. And the only thing I can think of in the history of slavery to compare them to are the Inquisition records that historians of slavery in Latin America and Brazil have access to. And so it's really remarkable sources. Like I said, they're problematic. We have to be very careful reading them and not reading too much into the thought of it. But the action, there's such a great set of documents to use.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
We know from our discussion that slaves in Boston resisted slavery in ways that helped them adapt to and shape the contours of their condition. But, in your opinion, what might have happened if slaves had mounted a rebellion in Boston like the slaves of South Carolina did in the 1739 Stono Rebellion? Would such a rebellion have changed the nature of slavery in Boston?
This is actually kind of an interesting question, because we do have the instance of a slave conspiracy in Boston, the 1723 conspiracy I just talked about. And what I found fascinating about that conspiracy is the aftermath of it. So, like I said, 5 slaves are arrested, 1 indentured servant. 1 slave, Diego, is executed. The other 4 are all acquitted for lack of evidence. All they have is Diego's confession to execute on. And what's interesting here is that you see an extreme exercise of judicial restraint, where there's not enough evidence, despite the fact that even after Diego was apprehended, fires continued and everything. So there's the kind of judicial restraint. But what's also interesting is one of the men, a guy named Elisha Cook, who was the Speaker of the Massachusetts Assembly, and he's also the moderator of the Boston Town Meeting, very prominent politician. Some of his tenements were targeted by the conspiracy. And he, over the course of 1723, tries to pass the Boston Slave Code that was passed in that year at the colonial level. He tries 13 times, and it fails every time. And so the question is, if there was a massive slave conspiracy, how would that have affected slavery? I think what would have happened is it would have seriously hurt the institution of slavery in Boston. There are masters committed to slavery. And one of the things you see, for example, during the conspiracy of 1723, there's an imperial official whose name's Thomas More in town. And More has this great line. He says, masters would rather be burnt in their beds than bring in white servants and give up their slaves. I think if that was actually tested, if there's a wholesale sort of rebellion, one of 2 things would have happened. One is they'd use extreme violence to put it down, with large numbers of casualties. This is, of course, not uncommon, like Stono, like the New York conspiracy. I think the exact same thing would have happened there. But it also would have probably hastened the end of slavery in Massachusetts. It may have finally been the tipping point to turn public opinion against slavery to the point that perhaps a mass selling out of the colony, because it doesn't seem to me that there is the legal desire, the legal will there to push through these really burdensome legal codes. And so rather, I think it would be a process of gradually eliminating slavery after the use of extreme violence.
What aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
I'm currently working on 2 projects. The first is kind of a short, accessible, comprehensive history of slavery in New England as a whole, to kind of write an updated scholarly introduction for the general readership. Just a short little book about slavery in colonial New England. The other project I'm working on is examining the construction of fortifications across the British Atlantic world during the Age of the Glorious Revolution, so roughly 1689 to 1715. And the idea is to look at the intersection between labor and empire, and make the argument essentially that labor has these physical manifestations that need to be constructed, and so the politics of labor are heavily influencing the shape of the empire.
In addition to your 2 book projects, you also blog. Where can we look for more information about you, your work, your blog posts, and how we can get in contact with you?
My blog with the African American Intellectual History Society, I put out an article once a month on the 22nd of every month, so you can look for it on that day. Most of my blogging centers around using, especially these sources that are in the book, to kind of better understand pre-revolutionary, late colonial intellectual life of African Americans, free black and enslaved people, trying to get at that kind of pre-revolutionary intellectual history. And can we do that? Which I answer emphatically yes, by writing these blog posts. As for other contact, you can contact me at my university email, which is jared.hardesty@wwu.edu. And I'm happy to field any sort of questions or anything you have about the book. I hope everybody enjoys it.
Jared Hardesty, thank you for showing us how slaves in colonial Boston lived and what their lives were like.
Oh, thank you for having me, Liz.
Colonial Bostonians practiced slavery, and slavery in Boston looked very different than it did in the South or in the Caribbean. As we discovered, Boston had an unbalanced slave population with 60% male slaves. Many slaves did not live in separate slave quarters, but inside their masters' homes. Also, Boston slaves didn't work as field hands. They worked as skilled artisans or domestic servants. And many Boston slaves could read. Jared raised a thought-provoking idea, his continuum of unfreedom. As he called to our attention, many white men and women lived in unfree states during different points of their lives. Many men had apprenticeships in which their labor belonged to master tradesmen, and women, Well, women lived under the legal authority of their fathers and their husbands if they married. But slaves always lived in a state of unfreedom. They may have been able to negotiate free time and working conditions, but their labor was rarely their own. And even when free, the city of Boston and the colony of Massachusetts Bay ensured that they would live in a state of quasi-freedom, which, as Jared pointed out, sounds like a very tough life. You can find more information about Jared, his book Unfreedom, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/083. If you enjoyed this episode or love the show, please tell your friends, family, or the person walking next to you about Ben Franklin's World. Word of mouth support is the highest compliment you can give, and by spreading the word about Ben Franklin's World, you'll help an unknowing history lover find out about our great show. Finally, what do you think of Jared's notion of a continuum of unfreedom? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.